The forests, so peaceful, or so they seem. Yet beneath their sweeping canopies, something stirs in the hidden dark. From the ancient hollows of Dolly Sods in West Virginia, where a traveler finds a creature that defies reason, to the silent watch of Pennsylvania's Kinzua Bridge, where a pale and impossible figure lurks just out of sight. Two stories of dread, each one steeped in mystery and shadow. Step into the abyss and welcome to Weird Encounters, a place where the ordinary fades into shadow and the unexplainable comes alive. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, and join our ever-growing community of the curious. Your support is the lifeblood that keeps this channel alive. Now, prepare yourself, for what you're about to witness is not for the faint of heart. My family and I have a long tradition of traveling through rural West Virginia. It's something my grandfather started decades ago when he used to fish the Tygart Valley River. I've always been fascinated by that stretch of wilderness around the Monongahela National Forest. So lush, so quiet, and sometimes so oppressively silent it feels like the trees are holding their breath. I went back there late summer, toward the end of August 2023, around the Dolly Sods Wilderness area. If you're not familiar with that region, it's part of the higher altitude plateau in the eastern part of West Virginia, known for its beautiful rocky plains and sudden changes in weather. But that's not what struck me this time. I remember pulling up to Red Creek Trailhead around 3 in the afternoon. My friend, let's just call him Ty, was with me. We had heard about the unusual sightings from a local off-duty ranger a couple of days prior. The ranger mentioned a strange-looking deer wandering around and to stay away from it as it might be injured. A deer with wrong-looking limbs. I remember hearing those rumored animals that appear almost like deer, but move all wrong, have awkward angles to their joints, and sometimes stare at you with an unsettling intelligence. His expression told me there was more to it. We planned to hike in before dusk, find a decent clearing, and camp overnight. That was the idea, anyway. The day went relatively normal. Lots of chirping birds, that constant rustling of leaves in the canopy, and the occasional scurry of chipmunks. Toward twilight, that quiet you get in thick forest started to settle in. You might know what I mean. The birds quiet down, the air gets still, and you suddenly become aware of how far you are from any main road. It's eerie. Even Ty, who's usually a chatterbox, didn't say much. He just kept adjusting his backpack, muttering about how it felt heavier than usual. At some point, maybe around 8 p.m., we found a small meadow-like clearing. It was near a stand of spruce trees, and there were no signs posted that we couldn't camp there. We started a fire, got our tents set, and cooked dinner. Everything was fine until the fire started dying down around 11 o'clock. That's when I noticed something big moving at the edge of the tree line. You know how your eyes play tricks when you're tired and only have firelight for illumination? I thought it was a deer, tall, graceful shape with a set of antlers that caught the glow of the flames. But it was too still. Deer usually look skittish, even if they're frozen in place. But this thing just stood there. I can't say it was staring at me. It was too dark. But it felt like it was waiting for something. Ty said something along the lines of, "Do you see that?" He whispered it, though I could still hear the tremor in his voice. We both watched. I remember the crickets suddenly stopping, or maybe I just tuned them out because my heartbeat was so loud in my ears. Then the creature moved, 1 step, 2 steps. The way it stepped, it wasn't quite quadrupedal, but it wasn't fully bipedal either. More like some malformed stance between the two. The knees bent inward, almost like it was folding in on itself. I must have blinked because, in an instant, it was gone. No rustling branches, no snapping twigs, nothing. Just gone. We spent the next hour or so in a stiff, uneasy silence, occasionally shining flashlights into the woods. We never saw it again that night, but I felt it there. It's that sensation you get when you know you're being watched, or at least followed at a distance. The next morning, we debated hiking deeper, but curiosity got the best of us. We passed an older couple from Ohio who said they'd been camping in the area for a few days. They looked spooked, like they hadn't slept. They mentioned hearing low growls at night, far deeper than a bobcat, but not like a black bear either. The man, who said he'd hunted these mountains for 20 years, swore it didn't sound natural. He hinted at old legends the locals talk about, something akin to a shapeshifter or corrupted forest spirit that masquerades as deer or other wildlife. I could tell he didn't want to say much more. He kept fiddling with his wedding band and looking over his shoulder as if he expected that thing to show up in broad daylight. We pressed on. The day was bright, but I still had that uneasy weight in my gut. We made it a couple more miles up the trail near the small waterfalls along Red Creek. That's when we saw tracks, not hoofprints exactly, though they had the general shape of a deer track. But there were these elongated, heel-like impressions behind them, almost as if a bare foot had partially stepped in the mud. Ty took a bunch of photos, but they came out blurry. I'm kicking myself for not bringing better camera gear, but you know how it goes when you think you're just having a normal hike. We spent that second night in a more concealed spot, thinking maybe we'd be safer or at least less noticeable. Around midnight, it started drizzling. I can't say for sure if I heard footsteps or just raindrops tapping on the leaves, but I do remember the distinct sensation that something was circling our tent. Ty shook me awake at one point, claiming he smelled something foul, like rotting meat. I told him it was probably just a raccoon rummaging around, but deep down, I felt otherwise. The next morning, we found no paw prints or hoof prints, just this weird swirl in the ground cover, as if something slid around on all fours, smearing wet leaves and pine needles in a circular pattern. The stench lingered, though, and it made me gag. We cut our trip short after that. As we hurried back, we ran into a park ranger by the name of Jensen near the Canaan Valley Resort area. He warned us that some folks had recently gone missing, an older hiker last seen at Seneca Creek Trail, and before that, a young couple whose car was found abandoned on Forest Road 19. Jensen didn't offer any conclusions, but he stressed how important it was not to hike alone or without letting people know your route. Then he asked us if we'd seen anything strange, almost too casually. Ty started to mention the weird deer-like creature, but the ranger just kind of nodded and said, "I hear a lot of stories." He told us to be safe and left it at that. I'd read about government cover-ups of unusual sightings in Appalachia before. I never put much stock in them, until now. I couldn't shake the feeling that these rangers know more than they're letting on, or maybe they're just as confused as we are but are told not to speak about it. When I was a kid, my dad used to say, "Sometimes the forest sees you before you see it." That line keeps echoing in my head now, and I wonder if these entities, if that's what they are, have been watching us for longer than we ever realized. Since coming back, Ty and I have tried to find any official record of these sightings. We found a few obscure references online, mostly from local message boards and old newspaper clippings, but nothing concrete. A friend of mine at Marshall University said there's a rumor among certain anthropology students about forest watchers that might be behind these strange sightings. They claim the sightings go back to the early pioneer days, but the official record is scant because people were too terrified to write about it in detail. Whether that's true or just collegiate folklore, I can't say, but it lines up with what I experienced. I keep telling myself maybe it was just a sick deer or a black bear that looked strange in the darkness. But every time I close my eyes, I see those backward bent legs and that empty stare from across the firelight. If any of you have been out near Dolly Sods or the Monongahela Forest and have seen something odd, I'd like to know. I'm not eager to go back anytime soon, but I also can't stop thinking about it. It's like an itch in the back of my mind that just won't let up. Maybe it'll help me sleep at night, knowing I'm not the only one who's come face to face with whatever's lurking in those woods. I guess the best place to start is the weekend I spent near Kinzua Bridge in northwestern Pennsylvania just last month. It was early October 2023, right when the leaves were starting to turn that bright orange and red, but the air hadn't fully chilled yet. My cousin and we'd gone up there to see the Kinzua Bridge State Park, the new skywalk they built after the old railroad viaduct got taken out by a tornado back in 2003. It's mostly a tourist spot, but the surrounding forest can feel pretty remote once you stray from the main paths. I'd never heard any stories of weird sightings up there, but I guess I'd never really asked. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, maybe around 2 p.m., got our campsite all set up just off State Route 59, near the Allegheny National Forest border. That area is known for its scenic overlooks, especially at Rimrock, but we decided to be spontaneous and just explore some of the lesser-known trails. My cousin, let's call him Ben, had a friend from Warren who mentioned a network of old logging roads that might be interesting. It was supposed to be a short hike, but we started late and realized we'd probably end up trekking back after dusk. Well, we ended up deeper in the woods than I expected. The sun was sinking behind the tall oak and hemlock trees, and it got dark fast. Even the crickets seemed to slow to a crawl as we made our way through a narrow clearing. It struck me that we hadn't passed another soul in hours, which felt weird on a Friday, even if it was off-season for heavy tourism. At some point, Ben stopped and said he heard a twig snap. I remember holding my breath, listening. The entire woods had gone deathly quiet, like that moment right before a thunderstorm hits, except the sky was clear. We pressed on, trying not to freak ourselves out. Then we heard it again, a snapping sound, but from behind us this time. I spun around with my flashlight, the high-powered kind you use for late-night fishing. The beam cut across the trunks, revealing nothing but ferns and uneven ground. When we resumed walking, I had the distinct feeling we were being followed. Not in the sense of a curious animal or a shy deer, but more like an intelligence tracking our steps. It's hard to describe, almost like a low-grade static in the air. We both picked up the pace. That's when we saw something move between two trees. It happened so quickly that all I can say is that it looked pale. Not white like a deer's belly, but an off-gray, or maybe ashen color. At first, I thought it might be a lost dog. Then I realized it was taller than that, and it seemed to be on two legs. The shape hunched a bit, then darted behind a large tree trunk. My flashlight caught the glint of an eye. Or, at least I think it was an eye. Ben kept whispering about how it didn't look like any animal he knew. After a minute or two of tense silence, we forced ourselves to move forward. We didn't want to linger, but I also didn't want to run blindly in the dark. The path was barely visible, and we had to rely on the flashlight to avoid stepping in potholes left by old logging equipment. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched from just out of sight. I'd swing the flashlight around, but the beam kept missing whatever was out there. At one point, I swore I saw a spindly arm clutching a tree trunk, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the time we got back to the main trail leading toward the campground, my nerves were shot. We made it to our campsite around 9 p.m., which was pretty late considering we'd left around 4:30. Our camp neighbor, an older man with a small RV, noticed how startled we looked. He told us in a very casual way that people occasionally report weird sightings around here, mainly large canines or something akin to a crawler humanoid, though folks around these parts usually keep quiet about it. He recounted a story he heard from a local fisherman who swore he saw a pale figure crouching by the water's edge at the Allegheny Reservoir one evening. The fisherman thought it was a person in trouble, but when he approached, the figure scuttled away on all fours in a way no human could. That night, we tried to brush it off, telling each other it was probably a deer or even a bear with mange, just rationalizing anything that could appear pale in the dim light. But the uneasy feeling didn't let up. I woke around 3 a.m., hearing what sounded like scraping on the side of my tent. Ben was dead asleep or pretending to be, so I lay there, breathing as quietly as possible. The scraping eventually stopped, but I caught a whiff of something like damp earth mixed with an oddly sweet odor, almost like decaying wildflowers. I never smelled anything quite like it. The next day, we decided to check out the Kinzua Bridge itself, thinking the daylight and a public area might bring some normalcy. We walked the skywalk, took the typical tourist photos. At the gift shop, Ben mentioned to the clerk that we'd had a strange experience in the woods. The clerk just gave us this look and said something about how the local Seneca legends speak of forest spirits. She said she'd had campers come in before, rattled by sightings of strange figures in the trees around dusk. I tried to pry more details out of her, but she just rang us up and said, "Be careful out there." We spent the afternoon exploring the old train tracks and reading about the history of the bridge collapse. I got lost in the nostalgia of seeing pictures of the old viaduct standing tall and then snapped like toothpicks by that tornado in 2003. The area had been the pride of McKean County. Now it was a monument to nature's force. For a moment, I forgot about the pale figure from the night before. As evening approached, though, I felt that gnawing anxiety return. Ben insisted we not walk any more random trails, so we stuck to a well-worn path near the campground. We were about halfway through when a family coming from the opposite direction stopped us. They looked spooked. 3 kids, 2 parents. The dad mentioned seeing something like a person, but not quite right, lurking behind a fallen log just a bit ahead. The kids were teary-eyed, and the mom said she thought it was a trick of the light until it started moving. They couldn't describe the face in detail, only that it was pale and sort of elongated. The dad said something about the arms and legs being backwards. Hearing that made my stomach drop because it reminded me of what I saw the previous night, the strange stance, the fleeting glance of those limbs that didn't quite match a normal human posture. We thanked them and hurried back. For the rest of the trip, we stayed close to the main road. We left a day early, not even wanting to chance another night in those woods. I felt like we'd stepped into some bizarre netherworld that existed side by side with the scenic tourist attractions people come to see. I've been reading up on local lore since I got home. There's no shortage of stories from the Allegheny region, everything from Bigfoot sightings to odd white creatures that folks call the lurkers. Some say it's tied to ancient legends, others believe it's a government secret. The whole area once had rumored missile silos, and there's speculation about underground bunkers. I don't know what to believe anymore. I can't shake the memory of that pale figure. Part of me wonders if it was just an animal, but deep down, I know that wasn't anything normal. I'm not seeking fame or trying to spin a ghost story. I just need someone to hear me out. If anyone else around the Kinzua Bridge or Allegheny National Forest has witnessed something like this, let me know I'm not alone. And so we depart this story, left to wonder if our weary campers merely imagined a shape in the night, conjured by a restless mind beneath looming pines. Or perhaps those pale limbs truly do roam the silent trails of Kinzua after sundown, reminding us that some mysteries demand we keep looking over our shoulder long after we've packed up the tent. And so, another strange encounter fades away. A trick of the mind, or something far more unsettling. That's for you to decide. Thank you so much for watching my stories. Make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support is what keeps this channel going.